Most people hear Texas and they picture highways and high-rises, sprawling suburbs and tech campuses. But there was a Texas before all of that, a Texas that smelled like mesquite smoke and fresh-cut alfalfa, a Texas where Friday night football was closer to religion than sport, where neighbors knew each other by name and never locked their doors, and where a handshake was worth more than any contract a lawyer could write. That Texas is still out there if you look hard enough, but the world it belonged to has mostly disappeared and almost nobody talks about it anymore. This was Texas in the 1970s and into the early 1980s. The oil boom was turning roughnecks into millionaires. Cattle ranching was still a way of life, not a hobby. Small towns along two-lane highways had their own economies, their own identities, their own reasons for existing. Dallas and Houston were growing fast, but they had not yet become the sprawling megacities they are now. Texas still felt like its own country, and in many ways, it operated like one. This was the decade that gave Texas its swagger. Oil money flowed like water. Cowboys were still actual cowboys. The music coming out of Austin was raw and real. And being Texan meant something specific, something people carried with pride no matter where they went. Let us walk through what daily life actually felt like during that era. Some of this might bring back memories. Some of it might explain why people who grew up in that Texas never quite got over it. Let us step into that world. Living in Texas in the 1970s meant heat. Real heat. Air conditioning existed, but it was not the powerful climate control people know today. Window units hummed and rattled in bedrooms. Central air was a luxury that not every family had. People adapted. Porches were not decorations. They were where life happened. Families sat outside in the evenings because inside was still too warm. Screen doors slammed behind kids running in and out. The sound of cicadas was the background noise of every Texas summer. Houses in small-town Texas were modest. Brick ranch homes with big yards, chain-link fences, pecan trees that dropped nuts every fall, and kids who collected them in buckets. Vegetable gardens were common because growing your own food was just what people did. Tomatoes, okra, squash, and peppers grew in backyard plots. Freezers in the garage were stocked with deer meat from hunting season and vegetables put up from summer gardens. In the cities, neighborhoods were expanding outward. Houston was booming with oil money. Glass towers were going up downtown. Subdivisions spread in every direction with little planning and fewer regulations. Dallas was building its identity around business and ambition. Fort Worth held on to its cowtown roots, proud of them. San Antonio still felt old and unhurried, with the Riverwalk as its quiet centerpiece before tourism transformed it. The oil industry defined Texas in ways that are hard to overstate. The boom of the late 1970s brought wealth to parts of the state. Towns in West Texas and the Permian Basin that had been quiet farming communities suddenly had more money than they knew what to do with. Pickup trucks got bigger, ranches got fancier. Young men straight out of high school could make more money on a drilling rig than their fathers had ever seen. Oil field work was brutal. 12-hour shifts in blistering heat or bitter cold. Dangerous equipment. Men lost fingers, hands, sometimes their lives. But the pay was extraordinary for the time. Roughnecks would work 2 weeks on and 1 week off, then spend their money in towns that existed almost entirely to serve the oil fields. Bars, motels, and equipment suppliers lined the highways near drilling operations. The wealth was visible. In Midland and Odessa, in small towns across the Permian Basin, money changed everything. New schools were built. Churches expanded. Car dealerships sold Cadillacs to men who had been driving beat-up Fords a year earlier. The phrase "Texas rich" meant something during those years. It meant sudden, conspicuous, unapologetic wealth. But the oil boom also created a false sense of permanence. People built their lives around prices staying high. When the bust came in the mid-1980s, it was devastating. Banks failed. Fortunes disappeared. Entire towns contracted back to nothing almost overnight. That cycle of boom and bust is part of the Texas story that people tend to forget. Before we continue with the culture and communities that made this era so memorable, if you are enjoying this look back at how Texans really lived and want to explore more decades and places, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories about how Americans built the life we know today. The car culture in Texas during this era was something else entirely. Pickup trucks were not fashion statements. They were work vehicles. Ford F-150s and Chevrolet C10s with scratched paint and dented tailgates. A rifle rack in the back window was standard. These trucks hauled hay bales, pulled horse trailers, and carried everything a ranching or oil field life required. On Friday and Saturday nights, teenagers would cruise the main drag in whatever town they lived in, up and down the same stretch of road for hours, windows down, radio blasting. They would pull into the Dairy Queen parking lot, which served as the social hub of nearly every small Texas town. The Dairy Queen was where you went after football games, after church, after anything. It was the unofficial town hall of rural Texas. Friday night football was the event that held communities together. In towns where the population might be 2,000 or 3,000, the entire community showed up for the high school game. The stadium lights were visible for miles across flat land. Marching bands played. Cheerleaders performed. Parents, grandparents, and neighbors packed the bleachers. The score mattered, but the gathering mattered more. It was the weekly ritual that reminded everyone they belonged to something. The music coming out of Texas in this era was extraordinary. Austin was becoming the live music capital of the world. Willie Nelson moved back to Texas from Nashville and pioneered what became known as outlaw country. His 4th of July picnics became legendary gatherings. Waylon Jennings of Littlefield, Texas brought the same rebellious energy. Together with others, they created a sound that rejected the polished production of Nashville and embraced something raw, honest, and undeniably Texan. The Armadillo World Headquarters in Austin was the venue where this movement found its home. It was a converted armory with no air conditioning and cold beer. Musicians and audiences sweated together. The music crossed boundaries. Country fans, rock fans, and blues fans all mixed in the same room. Austin's identity as a music city was forged in those years. Beyond Austin, Texas had a deep musical soul. Tejano music thrived in South Texas and the Rio Grande Valley. Conjunto bands played at weekend dances. Zydeco came across the border from Louisiana into East Texas. Blues clubs in Houston's Third Ward produced artists who influenced musicians far beyond the state. Food in Texas during this era was simple, abundant, and regional. Barbecue was not a trend or a tourist attraction. It was how people cooked meat. Every town had its own pit. Brisket smoked low and slow over a post oak was the standard in Central Texas. In East Texas, the tradition leaned toward pork ribs with a sweet tomato-based sauce. South Texas brought barbacoa, slow-cooked beef cheeks wrapped in foil or maguey leaves, served on weekends with fresh tortillas. Tex-Mex was everyday food. Enchiladas, tamales at Christmas, breakfast tacos before anyone outside Texas knew what a breakfast taco was. Tortillas were made fresh. Salsa was homemade. This food was not celebrated in magazines or food shows yet. It was just what people ate. Chicken fried steak with cream gravy was on nearly every diner menu. Iced tea was sweet by default. Cornbread came with dinner. Pecan pie was the dessert that ended every holiday meal. Food was hearty because the work was hard, and portions were generous because that was the Texas way. The social fabric of Texas in this era was built on a few pillars. Church on Sunday morning was expected. Baptist, Methodist, Church of Christ. The buildings anchored every small town. Social life revolved around the congregation. Potluck dinners, vacation Bible school in summer, and community support during hard times all flowed through the church. Ranching communities had their own rhythms. Cattle auctions were weekly events. Feed stores were where men gathered to talk weather and prices. Rodeos were entertainment, but they were also working demonstrations of skills that people actually used. Roping and riding were not performances. They were job qualifications. The sense of community was tangible. When someone's barn burned down, neighbors showed up the next morning to help rebuild it. When a family lost a loved one, food appeared on the porch without anyone having to ask. People took care of each other because that was what you did. There was an unspoken code of mutual obligation. What defined this Texas was self-reliance wrapped in community. People were fiercely independent but deeply connected to the people around them. The state was big enough that every region had its own personality. The piney woods of East Texas felt like the Deep South. The hill country around Fredericksburg had a German heritage. The Rio Grande Valley was bilingual and bicultural. West Texas was vast and sparse and tough. The Gulf Coast was humid and industrial. Each piece was different, but all of it was unmistakably Texas. The Texas of this era was not perfect. Segregation's legacy was still painfully visible in many communities. Poverty was real, especially in the Rio Grande Valley and parts of East Texas. The oil economy created winners and losers. Environmental consequences of unregulated drilling were largely ignored. The heat was merciless and the distances were enormous. But for those who lived it, there was something about that Texas that felt permanent. The wide open spaces, the Friday night lights, the sound of a screen door in summer, the smell of brisket drifting across a small town on a Saturday afternoon. It was a Texas where people still knew their neighbors, where the land shaped how people lived, and where being Texan was not just a state on your license plate, but something closer to a way of life. That Texas has not entirely vanished, but it has been buried under highways and housing developments and rapid growth. The small towns have hollowed out. The oil fields run on different economics now. The cities have become something else entirely. For those who remember that Texas, who carry it in the way they talk and cook and treat their neighbors, there is always more history to explore.